My name is James Carter, and for the longest time, I believed I had everything under control. At 42, I was married to Emma, my high school sweetheart, who had become a force in the fashion industry. She built her brand, envisioned styles from scratch, and it wasn't long before it turned into a multi-million-dollar business, making waves across the country. I watched in awe as she made connections, closed deals, and grew her empire. I was proud of her, of course. Who wouldn't be? Emma was brilliant, driven, and everything I had ever admired in a person. But as her success grew, something else began to change. In the beginning, I was her partner in every sense. I was the quiet one in the background, sure, but I was there for every milestone, every victory. My role was clear. I was the man who kept everything running smoothly while she took the spotlight. As her company expanded, I took on more responsibility behind the scenes, handling logistics, managing marketing campaigns, ensuring everything was on track. I didn't mind. I loved supporting her, and I was proud to play a role in building something so successful. She was the star, and I was her rock. It seemed like the perfect setup. But as time passed, I began to notice the shift. She became busier, more focused on her growing brand, and I slowly started to fade into the background. I didn't just become an afterthought. I was treated like an accessory, something that was no longer necessary. She started to hire people who could take over the roles I once played: finance experts, marketers, PR teams. One by one, my responsibilities were handed off to others, and I was left holding things together in a way that felt more like obligation than purpose. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, this was her dream, her company, and I was happy to support her in any way I could. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel invisible. I wasn't the man helping her grow her company anymore. I was the man who stood beside her, quietly supporting her from the sidelines. And I couldn't help but wonder if she even saw me anymore. It wasn't always this way. I remember when we first met, back when I was still freelancing as a graphic designer. I wasn't making a fortune, but I was doing okay. Emma was already making a name for herself, working in the fashion world and consulting for big-name brands. She had this energy, this sharpness that drew people in. I was captivated by her ambition, her vision. We clicked instantly, and soon we were inseparable. She had this dream of building her own fashion empire, and I loved being a part of it, helping her brainstorm ideas, strategize, and make those early steps toward success. Our life together was everything I had ever wanted. We built a home, traveled the world, and shared experiences that felt like they were straight out of a dream. But the more Emma achieved, the more it seemed like I was just a bystander. She made deals with Fortune 500 companies, expanded Envision styles, and became a name people recognized. Meanwhile, I managed the smaller details: her calendar, her events, the logistics. There was pride in my work, but it also began to feel like a thankless job. It all came to a head just 2 days before one of the biggest events in Emma's career: a gala in Miami that was a big deal for Envision Styles, a chance to solidify the company's place in the industry. I had been the one planning it, picking the venue, curating the guest list, making sure every little detail was perfect. But when I asked Emma where I would be sitting during the event, she casually told me that there wasn't room for me on the private jet she had chartered for her executive team. "Sorry, babe," she said over the phone, her tone almost too rehearsed. "I've got the team with me, and we're at full capacity. You'll have to take a commercial flight down. Maybe try Delta or something." It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she said it. Like it was no big deal. Like I wasn't even important enough to be considered. And in that moment, I realized something I had refused to admit to myself for too long. I wasn't just invisible to her. I had become irrelevant. It stung deeply. But it also woke something up in me. Something I hadn't realized I'd been suppressing for years. I wasn't just her supportive husband anymore. I was nothing. And as I stood there in the airport terminal, watching the private jet taxi away, I knew I couldn't let it go on like this. I walked back to the car that night, the weight of it all sinking in. I had spent so many years building everything around her success that I had lost sight of myself. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was a ghost, a shadow in her perfect world, and that was about to change. The next 24 hours were a blur of emotions. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing: I couldn't just let it go. I sat in our empty house, the place I'd helped decorate, the home where we'd shared so many memories. It no longer felt like home. The silence echoed, and all I could hear was the hollow sound of my own thoughts. I had spent so many years prioritizing her success, helping her build this empire. But at what cost? The man who used to help her grow her business, the man who stood by her side, had become an afterthought, someone she couldn't even spare a seat for on a jet. The truth hit me like a freight train. I was nothing to her anymore. I could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but more than anything, I felt a deep sense of betrayal. I had stood by her through everything. Her late nights, her business trips, her struggles, her successes. But in the end, I was just a convenient accessory when she needed someone to help with logistics, someone to handle the boring behind-the-scenes work. I had put everything into her dreams, but now I realized that my dreams had been forgotten. As I sat there staring at the empty room, something in me shifted. I had been living for her, doing everything I could to make her life easier, to support her as she built her brand. But somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. I had stopped being James Carter, the man with my own identity, my own dreams, and had become just another part of Envision Styles. And that, I realized, had to change. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to be the invisible husband anymore. I wasn't going to let Emma's neglect define me. If she thought she could push me aside and continue on without me, she had another thing coming. I was done playing the supportive, invisible role in her life. I had a plan. I had access to Envision Styles' financial accounts, something Emma had never thought to change after all these years. I'd been involved in the company's finances from the very beginning. And while Emma had always been the face of the business, I had handled the details. I knew every contract, every transaction, every supplier. I knew exactly where the company was vulnerable, and I knew exactly how to leverage that knowledge. I opened a new account in my name and transferred $2.5 million from Envision Styles' operational funds to it. It wasn't enough to completely cripple the company, but it was more than enough to cause serious problems. I wasn't stealing from her. Legally, I was still an employee, still had signing authority, but I was taking what I felt I was owed. This was a fair severance for the years I had put into the company, for the years I had spent helping Emma build this empire without ever once being acknowledged for my contributions. But I didn't stop there. I'd heard rumors about Laura Hughes, Emma's biggest competitor. Laura had been eyeing Envision Styles for months, trying to lure Emma's clients away. I had a meeting scheduled with her, and I knew this was my chance. I walked into that meeting with everything I had. Every piece of insider knowledge about Emma's business, every detail that could give Laura the edge she needed to knock Emma off her pedestal. I didn't think twice about it. I told Laura everything. Emma's upcoming product launches, her pricing strategy, her weaknesses. In exchange, I secured a consulting deal with Laura's company, a lucrative contract that would set me up for the future. It wasn't just business, it was payback. The next day, I watched Emma and her team board the private jet to Miami. I knew she was already in the air, leaving me behind without a second thought. But I wasn't there to beg or plead for her attention. I wasn't going to sit in the shadows anymore. I went to the airport, walked through the terminal with a sense of purpose, and found her talking with her team. I approached her, pretending everything was normal. I handed her a folder full of reports, documents that didn't matter at all, just an excuse to be there. I needed to say something, to make my presence known. Just wanted to say goodbye, I said, forcing a smile. And I brought you the latest reports you asked for. She barely glanced at me, barely acknowledged my presence. You didn't have to come all the way here for this, James, she said dismissively. Well, I said, forcing myself to remain calm, I figured I'd just check in. Make sure everything's good to go for the event. Her eyes flickered briefly to the folder before she turned back to her team. Thanks, she said, brushing me off. We're all set here. I stood there feeling the sting of rejection once again. I watched her laugh with her team, and it hit me hard. I had become invisible to her. But I wasn't invisible anymore. Actually, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, is there any chance there's room for me on the flight? You said the jet was full, but it seems like there might be some space left. Her laugh cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. James, seriously. The jet is full. You're embarrassing yourself. The words stung more than I expected, but they also gave me the final push I needed. I wasn't going to be her invisible husband any longer. I turned and walked away, heading toward the commercial check-in counter. I knew what I had to do now. Emma had taken everything from me. My worth, my identity, my place in her life. But I wasn't going to let her take my future too. I pulled out my phone, and as I sat at the gate, I hit send on the email I had written to her. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. And it felt good. The email wasn't just about the money I had taken, it was about taking back control of my life. The following days felt like a blur. I barely slept, but when I did, I woke up with a sense of clarity, like a fog had lifted. I was finally free from the weight of being invisible, from being the man who existed solely to make Emma's life easier, while mine slipped away unnoticed. My decision to take control wasn't driven by petty revenge. It was about reclaiming myself, about finally seeing my own value. Paris was everything I had dreamed of. When I landed, the city felt like a fresh start, an opportunity to reinvent myself. I met Laura Hughes and immediately got to work, leveraging everything I knew about Envision Styles and its clients. Within days, we had multiple meetings lined up, and by the end of the week, we had secured contracts worth more than I'd ever imagined. The money was good, but it wasn't just about the paycheck. It was about the validation I hadn't received for so long. For the first time in years, I was the one calling the shots. I wasn't Emma's sidekick anymore. I was the one building my future. Meanwhile, Emma's world was falling apart. I kept an eye on her company from a distance, and the cracks were already showing. Clients were beginning to pull away, and the tension in the air was palpable. The email I had sent her, informing her about the money I had transferred, hadn't even been responded to, at least not directly. She'd bombarded me with text messages, calls, and emails, all of which I ignored. I had no interest in hearing her apologies or explanations. She had made her choices. As my business with Laura grew, I realized how much I had underestimated my own capabilities. I had spent so many years defining myself by Emma's success that I had lost sight of who I really was. I wasn't just a husband or an assistant. I was a skilled businessman with my own expertise. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Every deal I closed, every step I took toward building my own empire, reminded me of what I was capable of. But even as things were looking up for me, I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction watching Emma's empire crumble. Her facade of being in control was starting to crack, and I could feel the fallout. She had been so wrapped up in proving herself to the world, so determined to stand alone, that she had alienated the very people who had helped her rise. It wasn't just the loss of clients or money, it was her loss of power, her realization that she had failed to see the value in those who had supported her along the way. I kept my distance, of course. I didn't want to make it about her downfall. I wanted it to be about me. But the satisfaction of knowing that Emma's world was starting to unravel, the same way she had tried to unravel mine, was hard to ignore. Eventually, the phone calls came. Emma's tone was different, frantic, almost pleading. She wanted to talk, wanted to fix things, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and I wasn't the same man who had once been content to stay in the background, helping her climb to the top. I had climbed to my own peak now, and there was no room for anyone else but me. When I finally returned to New York, I wasn't looking for closure or reconciliation. I wasn't even looking for an apology. I was looking for something far more important: my freedom. When I returned to New York, I knew things were about to get complicated. Emma had left me dozens of messages, all pleading for me to talk, to come back, to fix what had been broken. I had no intention of doing any of that. I wasn't interested in salvaging a relationship that had been based on my invisibility, my sacrifice, and my silence. I was a different person now. The man who had been content to play second fiddle for so long was gone, and I wasn't about to go back to that life. I walked into our brownstone with a sense of purpose. The house was eerily quiet, the way it had been when Emma was away on one of her many business trips. But this time, I wasn't the one waiting for her to come home. I wasn't waiting for approval or validation. I had built something for myself, and I wasn't about to let her reclaim any part of it. When I saw her standing there, looking as beautiful as ever but somehow smaller, more fragile, I couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction. This was the woman who had reduced me to an accessory in her life, the woman who had so casually dismissed me when she thought she had nothing left to lose. And now, she was the one who had lost it all. "James," she said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. Please, can we talk?" I took a deep breath. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I didn't feel the rush of anger or resentment I thought I would. I simply felt calm. "I think we're beyond talking, Emma," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I've spent enough time in your shadow. I've spent enough time waiting for you to see me, to see what I brought to the table. But you didn't, and I can't keep pretending like I'm okay with that." She stepped forward, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you. You've always been important to me, James." I raised a hand to stop her. "It's too late for that. You wanted to build your empire, and you did. But somewhere along the way, you forgot about the people who helped you build it. You pushed me aside, Emma. And now you're realizing what happens when you don't see the value in the people who've been there from the beginning." She looked at me, the weight of my words sinking in. She looked different, smaller than the confident businesswoman who had once walked into rooms full of power brokers. She had built her empire, but at what cost? Now she was left to pick up the pieces, and I wasn't about to be one of those pieces she could glue back together when it suited her. "I want a divorce," I said, my voice final, "and I want half of everything we've built together. The house, the business, everything." Her face went pale. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. "You may have built Envision Styles, but I helped create it too, and I'm entitled to my share." The shock on her face was almost palpable, but it didn't faze me. It was the same look she'd had when she'd told me there wasn't enough room for me on that private jet. I was no longer the man who stood silently in the background, waiting for her approval. I had made my own decisions, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of hers. The divorce proceedings were messy, as expected. Emma fought for every inch of ground, using every legal loophole she could find to try and undermine my claims. But I had the documents, the proof of my contributions. I wasn't backing down. In the end, I walked away with what I was owed: half of the house, half of our assets, and a substantial settlement. Emma had to take out a loan to buy me out of Envision Styles. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the power I had taken back, the control, the independence. I had built my life on my own terms, and I wasn't going to let her take that from me. As I walked away from the settlement, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't bitter. I had finally reclaimed my life, and that was worth more than anything Emma could offer. The best part? I didn't need her approval anymore. The months following the divorce felt like a breath of fresh air, something I hadn't realized I needed until it was finally here. I had spent so long living in Emma's shadow, caught up in the whirlwind of her success and her world, that I forgot what it was like to live for myself. But now, with the legal battle behind me and a new sense of freedom, I began to rebuild my life from the ground up. Selling my stake in Envision Styles to Laura was a decision that set the course for everything to come. I knew I wasn't just walking away from a company. I was walking away from a version of myself that had been tethered to Emma's vision, her path, her goals. As much as I respected what she had built, I had to find my own way. The money from the settlement wasn't what mattered. It was the opportunity to finally step out and create something of my own. I was no longer just James Carter, the husband of a successful entrepreneur. I was James Carter, the man who had the power to define his own success. I moved to a new apartment, one that was smaller than our brownstone, but filled with a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need the luxury or the status I'd once had. What I needed was space to breathe, to think, to build. Slowly, I began to find new clients, using the skills I had honed over the years, but never had the chance to truly showcase. I started my own consultancy, focusing on the very areas I'd mastered while helping Emma grow Envision Styles. Business picked up quickly, and soon enough, I had a steady stream of clients eager to work with me. It felt surreal at times, how easily I slipped into the rhythm of entrepreneurship, how natural it felt to be the one calling the shots. I was good at this. I knew I was. The satisfaction came not from the money, but from the fact that I was doing it on my own terms, without anyone telling me where my place was. One evening, a few months after everything settled, I ran into Cassandra at a business networking event. She was one of the executives from Emma's company, one of the people who had laughed at me when I'd been left behind at the airport. She had stayed loyal to Emma, but I could see the change in her now. She wasn't the confident woman who had once strutted around, basking in Emma's glow. She looked different, less sure of herself. "James," she said, approaching me with an expression I hadn't expected, genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology. For what happened before, I was awful to you. We all were." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by her sincerity. "You don't owe me anything." "No," she insisted. "I do. Watching you walk away from everything while Emma lost it all, it made me realize how wrong we all were, how blind we were to what was happening around us." I hadn't expected an apology, and I certainly didn't expect it to come from her, of all people. But it was a reminder of how much things had changed. Emma's empire was crumbling, and I had walked away to build my own. "Water under the bridge," I said, offering a small smile. "I'm doing fine now. Better than fine, actually." She nodded, and I could see the weight of regret in her eyes. "I've left Envision Styles," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'm working with a new startup. It's a fresh start." I gave her a nod of approval. "That's good. It's what we all need sometimes, a fresh start." The conversation ended soon after, but as I walked away, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The people who had once treated me like I was nothing, like I was just Emma's husband, were now seeing me for who I really was. I wasn't just the man behind the scenes anymore. I was me, James Carter, an independent man who had built his own path and one who was finally in control of his own future. I had left behind the life I had built with Emma, and while it was bittersweet, it felt like the only way forward. My future was mine to shape, and for the first time in years, I had everything I needed to make it exactly what I wanted. A year had passed since the divorce, and as I sat in my new office, looking out over the city skyline, I couldn't help but marvel at how far I had come. Everything had changed: my life, my business, my entire perspective. When I left Emma and Envision Styles, I didn't just walk away from a company. I walked away from the person I used to be, the man who had been content to exist in the background, the man who had let others dictate his worth. That man was gone. And in his place was someone who had finally realized his own value. Business was thriving. My consultancy was steadily growing, with a list of clients that seemed to get longer every day. I was building a reputation for myself, one I had never dreamed of before. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fulfillment that came from doing something on my own terms, with no one else's expectations hanging over me. Every deal I closed, every client I helped succeed, it was a validation of everything I had worked for. I wasn't just riding on the coattails of someone else's success anymore. This was my success. But as much as I enjoyed the professional victories, the personal side of things had changed too. I'd spent so many years with Emma, thinking I couldn't do anything without her, that I was only valuable in the context of her achievements. Now, I was learning to appreciate my own company. I wasn't just the husband of a successful woman anymore. I was James Carter, a man who had built his own success, who was capable of so much more than I had ever given myself credit for. A few months ago, I had met someone new. Her name was Sophie, and unlike Emma, she didn't see me as an accessory. Sophie wasn't interested in my past. She was more interested in who I was now, in the person I had become. It felt refreshing to be seen for who I truly was. We started spending more time together, and I found myself falling for her. She was smart, funny, and independent. Everything I had ever wanted in a partner, but had failed to recognize before. With Sophie, there were no power dynamics, no shadows. It was just two people enjoying each other's company, supporting each other's ambitions. As things grew more serious, I couldn't help but reflect on the lessons I had learned over the past year. The biggest one? Self-worth. I had spent so long allowing others to define me. First Emma, then the people around her, that I had forgotten what it was like to simply exist for myself. I had spent too many years looking to someone else for validation, for approval. But the truth was, I didn't need anyone to tell me what I was worth. Emma had tried to define me, tried to make me feel small so she could feel bigger. But in doing so, she had only helped me realize just how much I had to offer. I didn't need her approval to succeed. I didn't need her at all. I looked at the photograph of Sophie and me on my desk, a recent picture from a weekend getaway we'd taken to the coast. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling. I smiled at the picture, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly content. I had lost a lot in the past year. My marriage, the life I thought I was meant to live, but I had gained so much more. I had gained myself. I had gained my freedom, and that was worth more than anything I could have ever built with Emma. As I closed my laptop and prepared for another day of work, I knew this was only the beginning. My future was wide open, and for the first time, I was the one holding the reins. A year had passed since the divorce, and I could finally say I had made peace with the past. The house I'd once shared with Emma felt like a distant memory now, one that had long since faded into the background. I had moved on, not just physically, but emotionally, in a way I never thought possible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but the man I was now was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. I had learned to embrace who I was, to appreciate the person I had become. My consultancy was thriving, more than I had ever imagined. My clients came to me for a fresh perspective, someone who had seen both sides of the coin, someone who had built something from the ground up and knew what it meant to fight for every inch of success. I was getting recognition in the industry, but the real reward wasn't the money or the accolades. It was the fact that I had taken control of my own destiny. I had learned so much from those years with Emma, both the good and the bad. She had pushed me, yes, but she had also broken me. In the end, her neglect had forced me to confront my own worth. For so long, I had allowed her to be the center of my world, to define who I was and what I was capable of. But once I stepped away from that, once I stopped looking to her for validation, I realized just how much I had to offer. And then there was Sophie. She had entered my life at just the right moment, when I was finally ready to receive the kind of love and respect I had always given but never received in return. Sophie wasn't like Emma. She didn't need me to be anything other than myself. She didn't need me to play a supporting role in her success or diminish my own in the process. With Sophie, it was different. She celebrated my wins, just as I celebrated hers. There was no power struggle, no manipulation. There was just mutual respect. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just someone else's shadow. I was seen for who I really was, and for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. Things had been moving quickly between us, but it felt right. Sophie was everything I had been searching for without even knowing it, kind, thoughtful, and driven in her own right. We spent weekends traveling, evenings talking about everything and nothing, and I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe I could still have the kind of relationship I had once dreamed of, but this time, it would be on my terms. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the man who had sat at the back of Emma's gala, forgotten and overlooked. I wasn't the man who had been left behind in the airport terminal, humiliated and invisible. I was James Carter, a man who had found his voice, who had built his life on his own terms, and who was finally ready to be seen as the person he had always been beneath the surface. I had walked away from the life Emma and I had built together, but it hadn't been a loss. It had been a liberation. It wasn't about revenge or spite. It was about me taking control of my future. And now, with Sophie by my side and a future full of endless possibilities, I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. As the months passed, everything seemed to fall into place. My life had taken on a rhythm I never expected, but one that felt so right. I had come to embrace the solitude that followed the end of my marriage, and as the noise of the past faded, I found clarity. I wasn't just moving on, I was growing. I was becoming someone I could be proud of, someone who no longer defined himself by the people around him. It was liberating in a way I hadn't known was possible. Business had never been better. My consultancy was flourishing, and every new client felt like a confirmation that I was on the right path. I had built a reputation as someone who understood both the highs and the lows of the business world, someone who had been at the top and had learned the hard way what happens when you forget who you are. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I was the one making decisions, calling the shots, and seeing the results. The satisfaction came not from the contracts or the money, but from the knowledge that I had done this all by myself. Sophie and I had become a steady part of each other's lives, a natural fit in a way I couldn't have imagined before. With her, everything felt easy. There were no power plays, no games. It was just two people who genuinely cared about each other. She encouraged me in ways Emma never had, not by boosting my ego, but by letting me find my own strength. She never made me feel small or unimportant. Instead, she saw me for who I truly was, a partner, not an accessory. It was a dynamic I had never experienced before, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for it. But even as things continued to improve, I couldn't completely escape the shadow of the past. Every now and then, I would hear something about Envision Styles or Emma's latest deal, and a part of me would still feel that old ache, that reminder of who I once was. It wasn't jealousy or resentment, but something more complicated, a strange, bittersweet feeling of having built a life with someone, only for that life to shatter when you realize you weren't seen for the person you truly were. I used to think that Emma's success was the thing that defined me. I used to think that being in her world, being part of her story, would make me feel whole. But I had learned the hard way that success, at least the kind that came at the expense of others, wasn't enough to build a fulfilling life. What I had learned, what I had built, was my own sense of purpose. And now I was finally living it. Sophie and I were planning a trip to Europe in a few weeks, and as we sat over dinner one night, discussing our itinerary, I realized how far I had come. I was no longer the man who had been left behind at the airport, or the one who had spent years trying to prove his worth to someone who could never see it. I was no longer the man who had let someone else define him. I had found my own voice, my own place in the world. And as I looked at Sophie, I knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever the future held, I was ready for it. Not because I had someone else to lean on, but because I had learned to stand on my own. And for the first time in my life, I knew that was enough. Life is too short to live in the shadows of others. Don't define your worth by someone else's success or approval. You are more than the roles others assign you, whether it's a partner, an employee, or a background figure. Embrace your own strengths, take ownership of your life, and never be afraid to walk away from situations that don't value you. True fulfillment comes from within, from knowing your worth and standing firm in it. Build your life on your own terms and surround yourself with people who see you for who you truly are. You deserve nothing less.